I will officially start the meeting with my Melly Bell. So welcome everyone. We have a great speaker today. We're really privileged to have Scott with us. And so welcome and look forward to a great discussion on coronavirus economics. Coronavirus has very much dominated our world in the last year. And one of the opportunities that has recently come about is that 9 News Health, who is an organization that we have been very affiliated with, they are now sponsoring and holding coronavirus COVID vaccine clinics. You all have an opportunity, if you'd like. Some of you have already done so and enlisted through Rotary, but we also have, I'll put it in the chat, the 9healthvolunteer.org website for you to volunteer if you're interested. It's a very safe environment. Some of us on the call are either fully vaccinated or I'm halfway there. And so there are many opportunities, parking lot, there's training in advance, there's 4-hour sessions in the morning if you'd like, or a 4-hour session in the afternoon. Again, I will put the chat or the link into the chat. If you would like to sign up, we have found that it's easiest for you to do it directly through the 9Health website. We had so much interest in the Rotary organization and we were funneling it through one person that with Lisa Goulias and Mark Whipper's help, we've streamlined that process for you to be able to go directly into the 9 News site. There is a notes section that you can put that you are with Rotary. We are trying to at least track and understand how much Rotary involvement there has been. It's exciting. I think it's part and parcel to the work that Rotary around the world has done in the vaccination program against polio. And so we've been looked at as a guiding example and also an assistance and a volunteer opportunity. So I will send that in the link as soon as I get a second to do that. All right, please join me. You will be muted, but join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I would like to welcome to the Zoom podium Pete Wall, who will give our inspirational moment today. Pete is a past Denver Rotary Club Foundation president. He is of counsel of Burns, Wall, and Mueller PC. Pete.
Thank you, President Debbie. And I continue to be inspired by fellow Rotarians, and what you just described about the 9Health Fair is further to that point. But I need go no further than Todd Bacon celebrate our service stories over the last several months. There have been 18 wonderful stories about the service and engagement of many Denver Rotarians in a variety of ways. And Todd himself is an inspiration to me for putting together these celebrations during this pandemic period. And every single celebration is an inspiration in a variety of ways. And of course, since there were 18, time does not permit a description of all of them, but they include international projects of our World Community Service Committee, chaired by John Finnegan, such as Bill Korstadt's Water and Sanitation Project in Burkina Faso, West Africa, Felicia Mustic's Education and Literacy Project in Bosnia, as well as local projects like the Peach Sale, headed up by Brian Geis and Kevin Saudi with a lot of volunteers in very trying times last fall, and goes on to the Cherry Creek cleanup organized by Andrew Walker. And President Debbie was there with her husband helping out, as well as Lisa. So I'm so impressed by everybody that's in this club and people working hard and doing so much. And I think that Todd's celebrations are inspiring snapshots of Club 31 service around the corner and around the world, as it is said. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. I could not agree more. That is really true. I, having personally been to the most recent trail cleanup. It's really a lot of fun, and you'll hear about that with a little more detail from Troy Szymanski. Troy is our club secretary. He is also partner and fund manager for Outpost Fund, and he will be doing our announcements.
All right, thank you very much, President Debbie. First off, we want to welcome all of our guests and potential new members joining us. We're glad you decided to start your Thursday afternoon with us here at Denver Rotary. Some birthdays. So if you will all join me in wishing a happy birthday to Steve Tucker, Greg Osborne, Bruce Wagner, Jim Wiltshire, and Jim McFall. All those birthdays will be happening over the course of this next week. So join me in sending them a message, say happy birthday from Denver Rotary. All right, then some announcements. Our next virtual happy hour is Wednesday, March 24th. So next week at 5:30 p.m. The Zoom link will be provided in our Tuesday meeting email. So keep an eye out for that early next week. Next up, we have Perform Something Cool or Just Be a Fool for Rotary from 5:30 to 7:30 on Thursday, April 1st, which is April Fool's Day. Join us for a night of fun and bring your own libations live via Zoom as we raise $20,000 or more for our Denver Rotary Club Foundation grantees. In addition to the untalented performances, there will be trivia, games, prizes, and, of course, laughter. Wear your blue and gold for Rotary. Wear a funny hat. Just come and have fun. Untalented performers, don't be shy and sign up by March 24th at 5 p.m. to be part of the show. The sign-up link will be in the meeting recap email this afternoon. Yes, we do want to raise more funds to do great things through the DRCF, but we also want to have fun as a club, so don't miss it. Also want to ask you to save the date for Saturday, April 17th at 9 a.m. For an opportunity to join your fellow Rotarians for an active and socially distanced service project, the Cherry Creek Trail Cleanup. Please consider participating to help keep this popular trail clean, safe, and enjoyable for all. In celebration of Earth Day, which is a few days later on April 22nd, for every volunteer that participates, Chair Andrew Walker will donate $5 to the Grow House, a Denver-based organization that cultivates community-driven food justice through education and food access. And I'm seeing at the bottom of this announcement, I'm not seeing a max number of attendees, so I am all for having as many people as can show up there to clean up the trail and have Andrew donate the max amount of money possible. So that's all from me. President Debbie, back to you.
All right, thank you, Troy. I would add to what Troy said about the Untalent show. Troy mentioned a goal of 20,000 or more. There is a Rotarian who has offered up $10,000 for a one-to-one match. So it's a challenge. The challenge is on. The gauntlet is thrown. Let's see if we can take that $10,000, double it, and then some. So hope to see you there. The Good News Buckets today is being sponsored by Peg Johnston. Peg is the Rotary Foundation Support Chair and Programs Co-Chair. She's the retired Principal and Business Acquisitions Ltd. So Peg, take it away.
I do have the privilege this morning of speaking, speaking for the International Foundation. And I can tell you all that our goal is $50,000 every year. It has been for several years, and we've been very fortunate to have made it the last few years. So help us reach it again today. Just a little information about the International Foundation. Last year, I just looked it up yesterday, $335 million went out to program awards from the Rotary Foundation. And only 10% of that was for administration and development of projects. So, and last week we heard about the malaria project. Well, Rotary International Foundation just gave $6 million to the malaria project in Zambia. So now you know kind of all kinds of programs. Pete mentioned a few of them that the foundation dollars go to. Now, when you donate, and I'll put it on the chat, please sign on to Rotary.org. Make sure you click on My Rotary. You must click on My Rotary so that it identifies you as being a Rotarian. And then once there, if you have an account, you can just put your password in and go ahead and donate. If you don't have an account, then say that you want to sign up for an account. It's very simple. All you need is your name and your email. So who would like to share some good news today? $20 is the minimum. Yes, okay, I see one. I see Pete up there.
Yeah.
And you can also click on the reaction down below and then your hand will pop up for you.
Yeah,
Pete.
Peg, I have some good news and some bad news. The University of Colorado, my alma mater, is in the March Madness. The bad news, they're playing Georgetown. But anyway, it's worth $100 to see how that goes.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you. Who else? Any raised hands here today? Oh, come on.
I see Jack Green. Jack, take yourself up. There you go.
Thank you. I have good news. And the good news is yesterday, a committee of volunteer Rotarians met to do the grant assessment and allocation of the Denver Rotary Club Foundation money for the years 2021 and 2022. And in the group, we had Mike McPhail, Bill Emig, Louise Westfall, Melissa Bowen, Jim Johnston, Jay Camlett, Stephanie Foote, and Chuck Turner, representing all of us in the club to come to a consensus on how we would divide out the money between a dozen very worthy, meritorious organizations. And it was quite a job to get that done. Everyone pitched in, they did their work. We got through it. We have a recommendation that we're proud of that we'll be presenting to the full board of the foundation. And for all the good work of all those good people, I want to put in $100 today.
Fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you. I don't see any other. Are there any other hands up? Good news. How did you all make it through the snowstorm? All right.
Mac West.
Mac?
Yeah.
You're on mute, Mac.
Okay, I think I'm real now.
Yeah.
Just a piece of information as I tried to keep track of what's going on in the larger world of museums. If you could see the chaos on the desk in front of me, it would include a new contract for the final bit of advising on the development of the new science center in Karachi, Pakistan. And I may actually have to go there.
Wow. Fabulous. All right. Mary Penny, did I see your hand up? No, sorry. Okay. Any other hands? It's hard to see when you don't use the reaction button.
Patrick.
I'm in my car. Do you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
We do.
Okay. So I'm actually on my way back from getting my second shot, which is a piece of good news. I'm a Gonzaga grad, so go Zags. I'm hoping this is their year. And lastly, we have an upcoming breakfast on May 19th. It will be virtual in support of Denver kids. I'll put the link in chat. Would love any kind of participation, including if you just want to tune in to the virtual event and learn more about what we do. We'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks for all of Rotary's support, and again, go Zags.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else have good news you'd like to share with us today?
Well, this is Debbie. I'll say some good news. I have had my first shot and I'm ready for my second. So has Chris. So we're very much looking forward to that. By the time we do our first hybrid in-person / Zoom meeting in mid-April, I will be fully vaccinated. So that's very exciting. I also want to take just a quick second to clarify my comments about the fundraiser. There is a donor who stepped forward, but we're really working through the details about whether it's a challenge match or a 1-for-1 match. So join in the fun. It'll be a surprise, but already lots of momentum around the DRCF Foundation and this, the Rotary Foundation. So thank you.
All right, I think that's it. Oh, we got one more up here, Jim Goddard.
Thank you. I just wanted to let people know that the project that we've been working on for the past 4 years has finally come to conclusion. We just took a tour of the Olin Hotel renovation. We've added 6 new units there for low-income seniors, and we'll be having a virtual reopening celebration, and I will make that invitation available to everyone, but I'll throw in $20 because I feel so good about how good that not only the common spaces, but the units look, and got great reviews from our residents as well. Thank you.
Fabulous, wonderful. Thank you all very much. Debbie, back to you.
All right, Peg. And actually, I turn that baton right back to you. I don't need to do another introduction, but please introduce our fabulous speaker for today.
Okay, I'm very excited this morning to introduce you to Scott Baier. He was in our breakout room as well. He's a professor at Clemson University and chair of the Department of Economics. He has a doctorate from the Michigan State University. And prior to joining the faculty at Clemson, he was at the University of Notre Dame. He's done research in the causes and consequences of globalization, the economic impact of free trade agreements, and economic growth. He was also a visiting scholar with the Federal Reserve Bank back in Atlanta. He served 2007 and 2008 as the Senior Economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And he's been a consultant to the Congressional Budget Office and the United States International Trade Commission. And on, I'm sure, many awards that I didn't mention. So Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And I want to make sure I state up front that I'm happy to stay on at the end if anyone has any additional questions or comments. So let me go ahead and share the screen, if I can find my screen. There we go. So again, thank you for inviting me. And again, I want to make sure I make a plug for the National Economic Education Delegation that John Haveman has really done a tremendous public good, I think, in terms of getting a host of what I think are talented economists, and then myself, together to present what we believe is the consensus view in terms of economics, and John has arranged for a wide range of topics, not only on COVID and economics, but also on the state of the economy, international trade, inequality, the economics of gun control, and on and on. So if you're looking for an economic talk for an upcoming event, I see some of you have birthdays coming up or your golf tournaments, you should look up John's site. And again, there are lots of interesting topics. So it has roughly been a year of the pandemic and how the pandemic has affected the economy. In fact, roughly a year ago on March 8th, John called me up and said, "Hey, would you like to do a COVID and the economy talk?" And at the time I thought, well, that would be kind of fun to do. I'm not sure it's going to amount to much. And as I was preparing my lecture on March 11th, if people remember that date correctly, that was the date where the NBA canceled its season and the NCAA postponed its conference tournaments. And at that point, I think all of us knew that we were in for quite a bit. The next coming months, I don't think a lot of people anticipated it to be a year. The next couple months would be quite a challenge. As it turned out, it has been a challenge for all of us. I have a lot of slides to go through, and I've spent a lot of time on this slide. But one thing I want to introduce the topic with, and this is just how economists have evolved in response to COVID-19. Normally, the economy just kind of slugs along, even when it turns down. It usually takes some time for it to turn down and then again for it to recover. What was different about COVID-19 was the rapidity in which the economy just seemingly collapsed. It happened over the course of just a couple days. And unfortunately, at the time for economists, normally our economic data comes to at best really monthly and in most instances quarterly. What we needed to do to advise policymakers was to have a higher frequency data, so to speak, to be able to see what was going on and advise policy. Luckily, in this world of big data, there were non-government sources who were collecting this data, and economists have been able to process that data. And so what I hope to present is is a visual story of what happened over the last year. And I think that'll paint the picture of what I think is going to happen over the next year. So again, with that rather long introduction, I apologize that. So let me quickly go through the outline for today's talk. I'm going to start out just briefly going over President Biden's proposed economic relief package that is now has passed into law. I'm also going to explain, as I mentioned, the initial impact of COVID-19 on spending and employment. And again, I'm going to use this high frequency data so that we could really visualize and get a sense of what happened, what the response was by the policymakers, and how the economy responded to that. Again, so I'm going to highlight the initial monetary and fiscal response by the U.S., discuss how the monetary fiscal response aided the recovery in the second and third quarter of 2020, discuss the reasons for the slowdown in the recovery of fourth quarter of last year. And again, I'll present what I think is a pretty optimistic view of what's ahead for us in 2021. So again, the most recent passed American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 has several components. I'm going to talk about each of these briefly here. In the upcoming slides, I'm going to relate these components back to what was passed last year so you can see how it all ties in. One of the more important aspects of the American Rescue Plan Act are, again, support for individuals who have been adversely affected by the shock. So one of the things that was implemented in the ARP was the extended unemployment benefits. Again, there was some bickering over the size of these benefits, but what ended up being the case was people have additional benefits up to $300 to continue on at least through the end of September. Second aspect, again, to provide some financial relief and some stimulus are the direct payments or the stimulus checks being sent out to the household. So it's roughly $410 billion in total value. And these are the checks that should be arriving in your bank accounts if you haven't received it almost any day now. In addition, other things that are included in this package I think are going to be important. One is that there's some aid to state and local governments. One of the surprising things that we've seen with COVID-19 is we thought most states would be adversely impacted in terms of revenue. As it turns out, a lot of states ended up, in terms of total revenue, ended up being better than they were in 2019 in terms of bringing revenue. However, the costs for a lot of the states were higher as they had to equip government buildings, schools, and universities with equipment that would allow to the transmission and teaching and distance learning. Again, additional support that's going to households is coming through the expanded and refundable child tax credit that will continue on throughout the year. And then there are a couple other things that are going to be important is the direct pandemic response. And what this basically includes and why this is important, again, is making sure that we're addressing the health situation with the shock, making sure that the vaccines are available and working through those distribution challenges, and then additional school support to get the schools up and ready to go. So those are the big things in the $1.9 trillion dollar package, again, providing aid and assistance to those people who have been adversely affected, provide some aid to state and local governments, and help get our schools up and running again. So I'm gonna start with the conclusion in case I don't get to this slide, but again, what's going to be important in my optimistic view for 2021, we know what needs to occur. And it's good to hear that people were getting vaccinated. What's going to be key again is making sure that we get a large portion of the population vaccinated. So one of the key things is going to be the distribution of the vaccines. The second thing that's going to be important is the efficacy of the vaccines and whether it worked for different strains that emerge. So again, the economy is you'll see a reoccurring story. The economy won't recover until we address this health issue associated with COVID-19. That's got to be first and foremost. The other things that are going to be important, the drivers are going to be the economic response to the most recent fiscal stimulus. The willingness, of course, of the population to continue to follow safety protocols and new and old ones that are put in place, again, to slow down the spread. And one of the things that I was amazed that occurred early on, as things started to slowly open back up, was the responsiveness of how businesses and firms and households responded to COVID-19 in terms of making it a safer environment, especially business and firms, a safer environment for customers to go in and shop and go kind of return to normal or return to this new normal. So again, what I'm going to highlight now is the recovery in Q2 and Q3 and how it was supported by both the improvement in the health situation and the fiscal and monetary support. And before I do that, I'm going to highlight this collapse that occurred. So again, to get an easy visual of what happened, we're going to take a look at real GDP. So think of real GDP as our measure of income or the total production of goods and services produced in the economy during a year. Again, the easiest way to think of that is just total income for our economy. I normalized the fourth quarter of 2020 to be, or 2019 to be 100. So any movement from there, it represents a percent deviation. So what we see here early on the first quarter of 2020, GDP fell by about 1.3%. Then in the second quarter of the year, GDP fell another almost 10%. And so on the year, we had a sudden dramatic drop of GDP of over 10%. In the third quarter, it bounced back. And again, this is kind of the benchmark of where we work off of. Yeah, let's just skip that to make sure we have some time. So here's what happened using this high frequency data, and this comes from Opportunity Insights. We're looking at spending of individuals, and I truncated this data around April 15th for a very good reason. And what we see here is this is spending on like almost all consumer goods. What we see here, so again, zero means spending relative to what it was, say, early in January of 2020 and December of 2019. So again, zero means no change in spending. And then this big drop-off, sudden drop-off that occurred right around the middle of March, you see that total spending fell by about 35% and remained low for well over a month. Again, and we can see the different incomes groups that were impacted. So we've separated here, I separated here in terms of low income, middle income, and high income. We saw the high income people drop their consumption by more or spending by more. And this shouldn't be too surprising, right? Because high income people had a lot of discretionary spending, so they could pull back on that, whereas lower income individuals don't have as much discretionary spending. They were buying the proverbial goods that they needed, and so they couldn't cut back as much as that. But again, what we see for all different types of individuals, we see roughly a 35 to 30% drop off in total spending that occurred early in March. Not surprisingly, we can break this up into different income categories or different spending categories, I should say. Again, not surprising, the only category in which we saw a increase in spending was in terms of grocery store purchases by households. Again, this isn't too much of a surprise. If you couldn't go out to eat or you couldn't do other things, you would go to the grocery store to buy your food and other things. And you can see this big run up here. This is, of course, the period of time in which we saw all the paper towels and toilet papers and wipes taken off the shelf as people were hoarding goods. But even after that initial hoarding went on, people were still spending about 20% more at grocery stores. Again, looking at these other categories, and again, I don't have all the categories, but here are the important ones where we see the drop off, where you see a drop off of roughly 50 to 80% in terms of consumer spending. It was in areas of accommodation and food services, entertainment, healthcare. Again, kind of a surprise that healthcare dropped dramatically. But remember, when COVID initially impacted the economy, routine procedures and doctor's checkups and dental checkups, all of those things were stopped for a time period. So while we did see an increase in health spending on one aspect, COVID-19, on other aspects, we had a pretty dramatic reduction. And again, the point of this slide, what you could see is the areas that were acutely impacted by COVID-19 were those areas that involve the service trade or individuals interacting with each other or interacting with groups. And again, just the idea of this health shock of the pandemic where people couldn't get together, it meant all of those spending categories were going to be reduced. Again, I ended this on April 15th for a good reason. I think a good reason, and I'll show this later. But economists like to say, labor or employment is a derived demand. That is, if people are spending in that area, we can expect workers to be hired in that area. So what we can see here, oops, I got ahead of myself on this slide. I apologize. So again, just to see where we were, take a snapshot of where we were on April 15th, spending in all categories was down roughly 25%. Grocery store was up about 20%, but you saw dramatic declines in entertainment, in food and accommodations by over 60%. But as I said, the demand for these services also related to employment in these industries. And so again, here's where we look at from, again, the beginning of the year, that big drop off that occurred in March up until April 15th, we saw a dramatic reduction in hours worked in all of these similar categories, whether it be food and drink, leisure, personal care, health and beauty, retail. All of those had a sudden and dramatic decline in hours worked. Why? Because customers weren't spending dollars there anymore. So again, using this high frequency data, it was pretty easy to see the industries that were impacted and to see the workers that were impacted. One of the good things I think economists did at the outset of this, they recognized that there were some issues with the economy, but generally speaking, the economy was in pretty good shape. So some of the fiscal policies that they wanted to put in place would be policies such that it would encourage employers to maintain employment at their place. Because if the economy is doing well, we want to maintain those worker-employee matches. And that idea was one of the reasons behind what is known as PPP, the Payment Protection Program, which gave loans to small and medium-sized firms, mostly small-sized firms. And much of that loan was, you were able to write that off as long as you maintained employment. Again, that was one of the ideas behind the program was, let's try to keep employment high and maintain good employee-employer matches. But again, what we see here in terms of hours worked is a dramatic drop off, and in employment in many industries, in particular service industries, we're down between 40 to 80%. Again, if you look at hours worked, and now here's where it's a little bit different. If we look at hours worked by income categories, we see the group that was mostly affected were the lower income groups. The high income groups and the middle income groups. The middle income groups had about a 25% drop in income. Low income groups went down, or high income group went down about 13%. But if you look at that drop in employment and hours worked by the lower income of almost 40%. That's a tremendous job. So that's some of the inequities or the distributional effects of COVID-19. It really impacted some of the people who had lower income. And again, when we think of the jobs lost in terms of food, accommodations, and services and leisure, again, those are typically people who are a little bit lower in income and then other categories. So kind of summing up what happened at the outset in March and April in terms of job losses, nearly 20 million jobs were lost. Over 8 million were lost in leisure and hospitality. Almost 3 million in education and health services, over 2 million in retail trade, and over 1 million in manufacturing. So that's where we stood at the end of April. And at that point in time, it wasn't clear what was going to happen in May going forward, but much to the surprise, I think, to economists, politicians, the economy started to turn around in May. And let's talk a little bit about why that occurred. The first thing, as much as we want to blame the past administrations for lots of things, I will give it credit for how quickly the administration responded with the CARES Act that passed on March 18th. Again, I worked at the White House during the Great Recession, and I think both parties were slow to react to the Great Recession. Here, again, both parties reacted really within a matter of weeks of when the pandemic and cases started to impact the U.S. I think the big thing in terms of impacting the economy was the CARES Act. The things that were important in the CARES Act, again, were the stimulus checks that went out and that payment protection program that aided the small and medium-sized firms that went out, again, to maintain employment. And in addition, we had the unemployment insurance boost. Back then, it was $600 per week, which is higher than the current one. So I'm going to focus in the next couple slides. You have a couple more slides to go through, but I'm going to show how the economy responded really to the CARES Act and to some other factors going on in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. Here's a real short graph I'm going to show of, here's where you see this is government transfers going out. So these are this big spike up here is government transfers. What is that? Those are the checks getting mailed out or being deposited in your bank account. So this was roughly $3 billion going out almost all at once. So you can imagine that would have a stimulative effect on the economy. And it stayed higher kind of than the normal base case all the way until really the end of October. The red line here represents those additional unemployment insurance that goes on and above what the states give. And again, what we saw was this rise quite dramatically at the end of March, and it stayed relatively high up until the end of August when it was more or less phased out. But then in December, there were some additions to that kind of kicked back in. So again, on the fiscal side, we had the stimulus here that gave checks to households and also gave heightened unemployment benefits. So again, it put cash in people's hands. What the Federal Reserve did, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Federal Reserve policy, but what they did was important. They actually did two things. I'll say three things. They reinstituted a lot of the programs that they did during the Great Recession. So again, that was quantitative easing, discount window lending, money market mutual funds, interjecting into that. They also did something new that they hadn't done before, which is essentially they almost loaned directly to firms in the primary corporate credit and short-term loans that they would give to firms. So generally speaking, the Federal Reserve doesn't enter into new issues of debt, and they dabbled in that a little bit this time just to get things going. The third important thing the Fed did was they implemented and ran that payment protection program. That was the loans for small to medium-sized firms, again, trying to give them funds so that they would stay open, trying to give them funds so that they would maintain their employment. So here's where we can see the response of the government stimulus. So on April 15th, roughly, that's when the checks went out, got deposited in people's accounts. And so what you see really after that date, where I cut the date off before, so we had this big drop off in spending, the checks went out, and what we see here is a steady march up of people's spending until we got to about early to mid August. Things kind of leveled out, and then things were really kind of up and down from November until the end of the year. If you look at what was going on in Denver, Denver looks very similar to the rest of the economy. You had a dramatic drop off back around, in early March. The stimulus checks went out in the middle of April. And again, you see this kind of steady march up in terms of consumer spending throughout the summer. By the end of the summer, things kind of leveled off and it was kind of up and down, but more or less a leveling of consumer spending that occurred in Denver following the implementation of the stimulus checks. And I should also say, followed those additional unemployment benefits. Where you see, where I think you can see the impact of the government actions a little bit more clearly is when you look at income spending by high income, low income, and middle income. Notice when you look at high income, there wasn't much of a response. One of the reasons probably high income people didn't receive the stimulus checks. Another reason was it was largely discretionary spending. But when you look at right around this date of April 15th, if you look at the response of low-income households, it looks pretty clear that they used some of that money to go out and spend. And then again, they helped ride them up with additional spending. So again, here is where we see the stimulus checks go out. A pretty good response in terms of high and middle income in terms of their spending. And then again, over time, what we see is an increase in spending, leveling off in the middle of the summer. And again, a little bit of a bumpy ride here in the winter months. But notice also what I highlight here with this last arrow, that last spike up here, one of the last spike ups was when those second round of stimulus checks went out, the $600 that were passed in the law 1229 of this year. So again, you can see how the economy is responding to the fiscal stimulus. But also, I think it's important to emphasize that it wasn't just a fiscal policy. There were things going on, I think, with respect to COVID-19 as well. What we can see here, this red line depicts the number of new cases with COVID. We see as those cases rise, again, the initial impact, that's when spending fell the most. But notice what you can also, the other pattern in the data, what you see is that at the end of, say, again, beginning around April 15th, you started to have a decline in new cases. Not only was there a decline in new cases, again, I think we had better treatments and better practices were put in place. And so I think the decline in cases and better practices also helped facilitate that growth in consumer spending. And we saw that rise again for much of the summer up until, again, when we hit early to, I would say late June is when we noticed it here in South Carolina. And in July, when the case numbers rose dramatically, that's again when I think we had a leveling off of spending where consumers either by choice or by edict stopped going out and spending as much as they did before. So again, not only do I think there was a fiscal stimulus going on, but also kind of the health shock had mitigated itself a little bit that led to some of this early turnaround. But as the case numbers climbed in late summer, I think that's when the economy also began to slow down again. So where are we today? When we look at the spending comparison today relative to where we were April 15th, overall spending is down about 1.6%. Again, grocery store spending is still higher at 14.6%, not quite at 20%. Food and accommodations is now no longer down at 61, down more than 60%, only down 14%. But here again, the arts and entertainment, you still don't have movie theaters open, still don't have concert venues open, shows open. Those are still down more than 50%. But lots of areas, what we've seen is a recovery or a decent recovery, at least to the point where we're at today. Again, looking at the hours worked, what we see in these different categories, again, these service categories that typically involve interaction between individuals, we see the economy trying to get itself back to somewhere close to where it was before. But for some industries, that just does rely too much on interpersonal interaction. And so we're still down, say, 30% in food and drink. In beauty and wellness, down over 25% in these areas. And again, this big drop here is just a Christmas and New Year's effect. I couldn't wash those away as easily as I liked. When I looked at Denver in terms of hours worked, you guys know more about what's going on in Denver than I do, so I'm not going to say a lot about this figure. But one of the things that stood out to me in terms of where Denver is in terms of these, in terms of personal services and professional services, and retail seems to be back to where it was prior to the impact of COVID. Again, other industries, again, the food and drink industry, some hospitality are all, and again, still lower than where they were before, down 30 to 50%. But again, we've seen, some march back upward. When we look at businesses openings in Denver, I think this is an important area, an area that economists are concerned about, because small businesses are really the drivers of the economy. When we look at small businesses, all small businesses are down about 32%. I think this is important for the people who are advising fiscal policy to address this issue so we don't have a large collapse in small business or a wave of bankruptcies. And again, you can see areas like leisure and hospitality are still down about 46%. Again, going back to a slide I showed earlier about the total job losses were nearly 20 million. If we update that to look at what has happened since then, so the red bars here depict the job losses in March and April. The blue lines here, generally speaking, are the job gains from May up until February of this year. And I think a couple things stand out. You see that area of leisure and hospitality. It's got a little bit more than 50% of its jobs back, but still roughly more than 4 million people that were once employed in leisure and hospitality are still not employed in that industry. Other industries like retail trade, I think, has done remarkably well. You see, we have almost got about 80% of the employment back, a little bit over 80% of the employment back in retail trade. So again, what we're seeing is some areas where the economy is recovering quite well. Other areas like leisure and hospitality, we have a ways to go yet. If we look at hours worked by income group, and again, this is where we can see the uneven impact as we forecast out over time. What we see is the uneven impact where high income earners are back to where they were before, but low income earners, our hours worked are down about 30%. And I know I'm running short on time, so let me kind of flip through a couple slides. This slide again shows the basic idea that the red lines are really lower incomes, blue are higher incomes, where we see in terms of unemployment, the unemployment is impacted lower income individuals more than higher income individuals. And here's what I expect, or here's what I think is going to happen going forward. So this is a nice graph that was put together by the Hamilton Project, and this blue line here represents their version of what they think is going to happen to the economy if there was no additional stimulus. Their estimate here is the impact of the Biden package or the American Rescue Plan that was just passed. And in this dashed green line here represents kind of what they refer to as where we should be. And notice what they say is going to happen initially is there's going to be some overshooting, but we're going to return to long-term trend. So it looks like their prediction is that there is going to be a pretty rapid response, partly due to the stimulus package, partly due to a natural recovery. And so what we would anticipate is certainly looks like here, they predict by the end of Q3, the economy will be back to its trend rate of where we thought it would be. I think this is a good graph. I think there's one thing wrong with that graph is if you look at what the Fed and what the government has said all throughout, they've underpredicted how well the economy was going to do. So I actually think that this line is probably lower than what it should be. And that Biden package is probably about right, but maybe we're going to get a little bit more overshooting, a little bit more growth than what we anticipated. And that's one of the concerns we have, is that maybe it'll be too much growth and we'll see inflation pick back up again. This kind of breaks it up into different parts of what's going to be leading it. In short, the big drivers of what's going to help the rebound this year is going to be those stimulus checks, those additional unemployment benefits, and to a lesser extent, the extension of the payment protection program. So going back to the recovery, going back to my conclusion, again, the economy is likely to recover in 2021. I think it is likely to get us back on trend of where we should be. It's going to depend first and foremost on how we address the pandemic. If everyone gets vaccinated and the vaccines look like they're resilient to new strains, all the better. How much does the economy respond to that recent fiscal stimulus? Then, of course, it's all related to what protocols do we continue to take and how do we adapt to this, and when do people feel comfortable coming back? In my view, and I'll stop here and take questions, I think once we get a significant number of people vaccinated, once again, the stimulus receives their check. So my guess would, even before President Biden's projection of July 4th, I'm guessing by Memorial Day, you're going to see the economy really starting to heat up again. And in that industry, that leisure and hospitality industry, I would expect to see lots of jobs being added back in those industries. So I used up almost all my time, but as I mentioned, I'd be happy to stay on and answer any questions that you have. I again, thank you for tuning in. And again, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I encourage you to look to see what other talks are available through the National Economic Education Delegation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. What we're going to do is I'm going to do a very quick wrap up of the official meeting, and I do have a quite healthy list of questions. So let me just first thank you for being here, and in your honor, we are making a donation to In Polio Now. And with that donation, along with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation match, we will inoculate 100 children in your honor. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah, and it's very, very worthwhile endeavor. We're so close to making it happen. The other piece of news I would share is that for our next week's meeting, so stick around because we will keep the line open about 5 to 10 minutes past the top of the hour if you're able to stay. But next week's meeting is Zoom online, Water and Science, a conversation about the Colorado River. That will be Eric Kuhn, author and retired water district manager, topic near and dear to my heart. And if you'll join me in the Rotary four-way test, then we will begin with the questions. So of the things we think, say, or do, is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you. And I'm not going to officially ring the bell, but I will go to our questions. And again, I do have quite a long list, and there are some coming in still. So if you can join, if you can stay, please do. So Scott, what is your view or the delegation's consensus view of the size and nature of the 1.9 trillion bill that Congress just passed? Too much, too little, or just right?
Well, I think that's to be determined. That's my chicken answer to give. But I think a fair amount of that was needed in terms of the unemployment benefits and the fiscal stimulus. and also the payment protection program. I think those were important things to address. So I would actually say it's about right. There are issues that people are concerned with. One is, as I mentioned, the potential inflationary effects, and I'll leave it to the Fed to handle those. So that'll be up to Fed Chairman Powell to raise rates if he sees the economy overheating. He certainly has the ability and the discretion to do so. The second thing I think is a concern that other economists share is just the increase of the debt and deficit, and what impact is that going to have, and how is that going to be paid for? Already, as this Congressional Budget Office states, that we weren't on sound footing in terms of the trajectory of the debt or the deficit. These additional packages, without being financed, don't help that situation.
Another question, where did the 3.8 trillion come from for both stimulus packages, and what does this mean for M1?
Well, again, the 3 trillion comes basically from, that was borrowing. And what we've seen this time is, in terms of M1, what I think, I'll separate that a little bit. Again, what we've seen is a relatively aggressive, loose monetary policy. Again, they're trying to address the pandemic first, and then once we get past the pandemic, they'll worry about the longer run situation. So I do share some of the concerns about inflation. We'll see how Fed Chairman Powell adjusts to a potentially overheating economy. The one thing I think that makes the debt and deficit this time different than the Great Recession was, during the Great Recession, the Fed expanded the money supply similar but not as much as it did this time. But what made it different then, the banking system wasn't, or the financial system wasn't in as good of a shape as it is today. And so banks were reluctant to lend money out, and they held most of that cash as reserves. This time around, the banking system is in pretty good condition. So with all of this money sloshing around, they're going to be less likely to hold on to it. They could lend it out. And again, that could fan the flames for inflation coming down the road as well.
Good. Understanding government support was needed because of the COVID economy. The national debt and annual operating deficits was dangerously high pre-COVID. How do you envision the government ever paying down the debt to a manageable level, particularly if we get to a higher interest rate environment?
Yeah, so the one beneficial thing we have right now, we're in a low interest rate environment, so it makes financing the debt a little bit easier. A higher interest rate environment will be much more of a challenge. I think the keys to how it'll be addressed looks into we've seen some indications of what the next spending and revenue plans of the administration are, in terms of an infrastructure investment, but also in terms of President Biden's tax plan. It does seem like he's going to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of raising taxes on individuals. Initially, it was stated that he was only going to raise taxes on individuals that make over $400,000. Today, I just read it's down to individuals and households that make more than $200,000. I would expect that number to continue to drop. My anticipation would be, except for the lowest income categories, I would think that individuals' tax burden or taxes will go up in order to finance the debt and deficits of the new spending programs. I don't see how you finance all the spending we have done by just taxing the top 1 to 5 to 10% of income earners. That's not going to be able to address the debt and deficit issue.
You've touched on this briefly, but what can the Fed do to mitigate the potential inflationary effects of the recently approved stimulus package?
So again, that's going to be, what they're going to have to monitor is what is happening with inflation rates, what's happening with medium-term bond yields. Once we see those bond yields go up, and once we see, say, inflation start to rise in maybe in just even certain industries, they may have to start raising interest rates or the federal funds rate, which is the rate that they target. Alternatively, what they can do to slow down the growth and circulation of the money supply is to offer higher interest rates to banks on reserves that they hold. So if you do that, then banks will be less likely to lend out their reserves if the Fed's paying them to hold the money. So those are two ways, a couple ways in which the Fed can slow down potential inflation.
How is the measurement of hours worked by non-hourly higher income workers accomplished by the Department of Labor or whoever generates that data? What is the source of that data?
By high income individuals, those end up are self-reported data. So again, you'd probably have to look at it with a little bit of a jaundiced eye.
How do you think the policies in places like Texas and Florida are benefiting their economies?
I think Texas is a little bit too early to assess. I've watched Florida a little bit more closely because they're right across the border here, and they've really done a pretty decent job, I think, overall of opening things up. Again, and it isn't in terms of what I think what often gets portrayed is they've just opened things up. They've done it with some precautions to protect, I think, some of the people that were more vulnerable, more susceptible to COVID. So again, I think they've done a pretty decent job so far. But again, I'm sorry. It's one thing I've learned all along, I think, as I've done these talks, is I think both states and countries have been a little bit too eager to run victory laps, thinking that they've done better than some other state or some other country. So again, this is a long run game we're playing, and it's a little bit too early to take victory laps.
What is your opinion of modern monetary theory?
Modern monetary theory, I think in low interest rate environments, I think there is a sense in which modern monetary theory is correct, in the sense of it's easier to finance debt or deficit spending. In general, I think I'm not a big proponent of modern monetary theory, in the sense of we all face debt and deficit restrictions that at some point is what we found in the 70s is, and across other countries. I think once you just start paying for government spending through issuing of money, inflation will eventually catch up, and it's not as simple to stop it by raising taxes on certain individuals. So I think that'll be an issue. Or that's one of the issues I have with modern monetary theory.
All right, we have a number of other questions, so we're going to keep marching through.
Sure.
Doesn't the dramatic and consequential increase in the national debt and current trend of a steep incline in annual deficit spending suggest that there is going to be a day of reckoning? There will be a price to pay that will be onerous and painful in the not distant future?
I would think that is true. I think what we see is, and we can go back and you look at the last 20 years, again, the US debt and deficit wasn't on a sustainable path. And then we had the Iraq wars and the Bush tax cuts, and then President Obama's stimulus package, and then President Trump didn't rein in spending, and now we have these additional deficits. What those additional spending programs have done is they've just moved the timeline forward. There is going to be a day of reckoning, and that is going to mean at some point that all individuals are going to have to pay for this, in the sense of higher income taxes and most likely reduced benefits, whether they be Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. We cannot continue to pay for all of these things with the revenues that we are currently receiving, and raising revenues, again, just on the top 10, 15% is not going to raise enough revenues to cover the growth in spending on those programs.
How about, would a $15 an hour minimum wage be positive to the economy?
I think in certain areas, and this is why I think it really is a state issue. I think in certain areas they can, they have the capacity to implement a $15 hour minimum wage. I know in South Carolina, what we would end up here is we would end up with a lot of kiosks that you would drive a fair amount of minimum wage workers out. So I think that, you know, a $15 minimum wage works well in certain areas. In other areas, it probably would have a deleterious effect on employment.
You mentioned too much growth. Why would we be concerned with too much growth?
Yeah, the issue with too much growth is the economist buzzword of the economy overheats and you get too much inflation. There's a certain capacity in which we think that the economy is, you know, producing at maximal production, and once you get beyond, you know, you can't move beyond that, and then what you end up is with just more inflation. That would be the concern.
There's a bit of overlap on some of these, but how do you propose dealing long-term with $30 trillion in debt, especially with higher interest rates and inflation?
Yes, so it will be, again, I think you're going to have to see higher taxes and reduce government spending. And again, it's mostly got to be, you know, really the long run drivers of the debt and deficit are the entitlement programs. And so I think at some point there is, someone mentioned a reckoning in which we're going to have to decide how we address the issues with the entitlement programs.
And are there any breakdowns according to racial groups?
In terms of how COVID has impacted? Yeah, so I didn't put those up, but again, for time reasons, what you could see is it's impacted, again, the African-American or Black community more, both in terms of male and female. What would be considered white or Caucasian and Asian individuals look pretty much the same. And the Latinx or Hispanic group is somewhere in the middle of those two. But again, I would say the African-American or Black community has a unemployment rate about 5% higher than the Asian or white population. Yeah, again, that's one of the uneven impacts of COVID-19.
The next question, do the positive impacts from CARES and the rescue plan justify the added national debt? Can we afford it?
Well, you know, I think sometimes when your house is on fire, you have to put out the flames first. So I think the CARES Act was one, well-intentioned. I may not have gotten everything right, but it was well-intentioned and implemented pretty quickly. I think we'll see how this one plays out in terms of its impact on the economy. We don't know yet.
Would you be able to share your presentation with us? And this is a side note from me, if you've got information on the racial component, if you can include that, would that be possible?
Yeah, so of course I will add a couple of slides with that, and then I will send it to Lauren. I have her, it's a big file, so I'll send it rather than through the Rotary.
Okay. Cool. Are there any adjustments relative to resistance to taking the vaccine?
Well, it's interesting. This isn't my area, so I'll rely on listening to Scott Gottlieb, who shows up every morning, I think still every morning on CNBC. What we're going to see is this over demand for the vaccine, which we still have now. I think in the next 4 to 5 weeks, you're going to see the other side occur where people will be begging people to come in to get vaccinated. That I think we're going to reach a threshold where you're going to have more and more people who are reluctant to get vaccinated. I think then that just becomes an information campaign. Again, continuing to show that the vaccines are safe and there are little side effects, and that they're efficacious.
How about supply chain issues, microchips for automobile manufacturing?
Yeah. So again, a lot of that was the initial impact of COVID-19, was it disrupted disrupted supply chains. And I would expect what you're going to see now is firms doing things now to have contingency plans in case something like this happens, maybe sourcing more things either within the country or more locally. With respect to auto parts, again, this was something that was caught by surprise that, you know, when everybody was in lockdown at home, they looked for entertainment at home. And so we started buying more and more electronics that required these microchips that left fewer for automobiles and left quite a shortage. And so we'll see how the market responds to that. But again, I think that was one of the things that caught firms and economists by surprise, was this switch in demand that led to a shortage of microchips.
You can tell there's a lot of interest. I have one last question, and so appreciate your staying on. In the context of returns to spending, how would you assess the impact of the delayed expenses such as rent, which low income people must catch up on?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how else to handle that. I think you can delay that over a relatively long period of time. I think a lot of people who own property and rent the property aren't multimillionaires, and they need that as a source of income as well, or they use that source of income as well. So you can't really forgive that. Perhaps you could have the government write some of that off. But again, that money has to be repaid. But again, I agree with delaying it for some period of time.
Well, my husband and I are both economists from our undergraduate days, and I also started my career at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. So,
oh, good neat.
I know. So it has been really thrilling to have you here. The power of Zoom, having you dial in from Clemson, has just been outstanding. I want to thank the program team, and I want to especially thank you, Scott, again for being with us today. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I thank you all for the invitation. Thank you for staying on. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it found the information useful or interesting. Thank you again.
We officially conclude our meeting with another ringing of the bell. So I will do that and send you on to the rest of your day and week. And thank you all very much, especially for staying on. Lots of great questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you.